That's very great. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. I'm Jeff Nonato. I will be chairing this webinar for today. Here for the Europa Commerce. I'm the president, and I was asked to chair. So it's a great opportunity to be here with you all guys today. And just a bit of technical information. We will have an active interpretation on English, German, Spanish, and French. You can do that on the button below to switch on your preferred language. And I would like to welcome everyone, Annika Flatten, Unicommerce Director, and of course, all the speakers that
Excuse me,
you're muted.
You must turn on your microphone.
Oh, so I was talking. Okay, is it all good now?
Yes, that's right. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. As I was saying, we will have speakers for today. Mr. William Hunt, Steven Rolfe, Eckhard Ernst, Iri Branca, also Jenny Vrangbori, and Pilar Rato Rodriguez. I welcome all of them. And of course, all the affiliates that are connected today. Welcome, everyone. I will just go through briefly the agenda that we have today. We will have the presentation by William Hunt and Steven Rolfe on the artificial intelligence and automation in retail, benefits, challenges, and implications. And then we will follow a discussion about that. And then we will have another 2 sessions. Part 1, impacts of AI in retail regarding employment restructuring and job change. And then part 2 is about the benefits, challenges, and implications from a trade union perspective. And I want to remind everyone that there's a Q&A feature down on your screen where you can ask questions and comments. And of course, we will bring them forward to the speakers. Also, I remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded. And I'm just going to give the floor now to Annika Flatten for a short info on Europa and the background of the project. Annika.
Thank you, Jeff. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Annika Flatten. I'm the director of the commerce sector at Europa. And sorry, I missed to start my video. So yeah, I'm Annika Flatten. I'm the director of the commerce sector at Europa, and Europa, the European Trade Union Federation for 7 million service workers. And we represent 272 national trade unions in 50 countries. The commerce sector are the biggest sector at Uni, and it unites retail, e-commerce, and wholesale unions from across Europe. For us to tackle all the sector-specific challenges. One of the challenges for the sector are, of course, the impact of the technology changes. And it was already difficult to overview, to understand, and to adapt to it before COVID. But now, due to COVID, this digital transformation of the sector has accelerated, and it's been quite hard to keep up. So we needed a timely insight to be able to raise the awareness and to understand this rapid transformation of the sector, to identify the challenges and the risks, look into the opportunities, the future skills needs, and also, of course, the role for the trade unions. So therefore, I did reach out to Oliver at FES, and he will soon present both himself and FES. And luckily, with the support from FES, we've been able to get this timely insight. And that is also being done with the great help from William and Steve. And they will also soon present themselves and the report, the outcome of this project. And one important part of this work has, of course, also been the commerce affiliates. So I'm really looking forward to today's presentations and discussions, because I really do hope that we will have some questions and there will be an active contribution from you as audience. And with that, will I just say thank you and hand over to Oliver from FES.
Yes, thank you, Annika. Thank you very much. And yeah, also on behalf of the Competence Center Future of Work, I warmly welcome all of you to the launch of the Europa FES report on AI and automation in retail, benefits, challenges, and implications. I just had a last look at the participant list, and I'm very happy to see that so many participants from also different backgrounds are here today. We have trade union representatives, members from the European Commission, but also participants from academia or NGOs who are working on AI on retail. So again, a warm welcome and thank you for being with us this morning. So my name is Oliver Philipp, and I'm a policy officer at the Competence Center Future of Work in Brussels. And as we are still quite new in Brussels, we were found last year, I would like to take the opportunity to maybe quickly introduce our center to you. So the Competence Center of the Future of Work is part of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, one of the oldest political think tanks in Germany and very close to the German Social Democratic Party, SPD. So traditionally, we are also very close to the trade union movement, and trade union organizations are an important partner to us. The aim of our center is to promote the European debate on the future of work by bringing progressive approaches into the forefront and kind of establishing an excellence knowledge hub comprising of a network of trade union organizations, progressive NGOs, and academic actors. Therefore, we are focusing on topics such as responsible digitalizations, empowering young workers, new forms of work, with a bigger project this year on platform work and platform workers, and of course, new technologies at the workplace, which fits very well to the to our topic of today. So to sum up, the question is how to improve working conditions in the context of digitalization. That's a key question for us. And that's why I'm very glad that we as FES can be part of this project and can contribute to this report on a very important topic, as I think. So because of course the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the digitalization and the use of AI in retail, and it has benefits for workers. Of course, I mean, digitalization brings greater flexibility in the timing and location of work, for example. But of course, it also has risks of increase of precarious and unstable jobs, or increasing worker surveillance and monitoring, just to name a few examples. So I'm very glad that we can discuss these challenges and implications today. And so I really want to give a special thank to Europa, to Annika Flaten and her team, but of course also to Steve Wolf and Will Hunt, the authors, for the excellent work and providing us with this important report. And of course also to all other speakers involved today. So I'm really looking forward now to the presentation of the report, and therefore I will stop here. I wish us all a fruitful debate, and I hand over back to Jeff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver, and also to FES Competence Center and of course to Annika Flat and Europa for giving us this opportunity to dive into the study. So without much further ado, we will hear from Dr. William Hunt and also Dr. Stephen Rolfe. They're both researchers at the Digit Research Center in University of Sussex Business School. They are both investigating on new digital technologies and AI, how these are changing the world of work, and they also examine the effect on these technologies on the retail sector. So without much further ado, I'll give the floor to them to present the study on artificial intelligence and automation in retail, the benefits, challenges, and implications from a union perspective. So the floor is yours. Thank you. Oh, may I remind everyone that there is the Q&A feature just right before the chat, where you can send in the comments and questions, and we will forward to the speakers right after when we open the discussion.
Well, thanks very much, everybody, for the very kind introduction. I think will be sharing the slides. There we go. So, I mean, it's really great to be here this morning and to see lots of familiar names in the participant list. Many of the people here were also participants in this research. We will tell you a bit more about the methodology in a moment. But we're very grateful for the people who contributed and made this bit of research possible. So our report is called Artificial Intelligence and Automation in Retail, as was mentioned, benefits, challenges, and implications, a trade union perspective. And though we do cover some of the benefits that these new technologies that are being rolled out in the retail sector in the report, we'll be a little briefer on those today, and we'll focus more on the challenges that these new technologies in the retail sector throw up for workers themselves, but also for the trade unions who represent or seek to represent unorganized sectors of these workers. So we'll only be able to provide you a very, very brief snapshot of the contents of the report in the next 15 minutes or so, but hopefully that will stimulate a bit of discussion and people will go away and take a look at the longer document. Will, could I have the next slide, please? So we begin the report really by emphasizing the huge political and economic significance of the retail sector. So in Europe, at least, retail is the largest private sector employer. It employs around 13 or 14% of the total labor force across Europe. That's about 27.5 million workers. So it's hugely significant in a purely numerical sense, but it's also critically important for a number of underrepresented and marginalized groups in terms of their ability to get a foothold in the labor market. So women workers, ethnic minorities, migrant workers, and younger workers are all overrepresented in retail, which shows the significance of this sector as a kind of foothold for many groups into the labor market. So it's hugely economically significant and also socially important too. On the other hand, the sector really has been quite neglected by policymakers and also suffers from low productivity compared with other bits, not only of manufacturing and so on, but also of the service sector in general. Productivity rates are low, wages are very low, and in general, the quality of jobs in the retail sector, again, compared to other service sector areas, is also quite low. So the sector is dominated by part-time work, by flexible contracts and insecurity for its participants. Now, into this mix of quite low levels of investment, low levels of productivity, and poor working conditions in general, we've seen over the past few years, and particularly with the rise of the COVID pandemic in 2020, new technologies rapidly coming online. So the report asks the question, what's happening in this context? What happens when quite low productivity and low wage sector meets the introduction of new technologies such as artificial intelligence and automation? And what are the implications and some of the difficulties that this introduces for the workers in the sector? Will?
Okay, thanks, Steve. So just to say a little bit about the research itself. So the research was funded and supported by Europa and FES, as has already been mentioned. And it involves 5 3-hour focus groups with trade unionists from across a number of different European countries. So we've listed some of them here. So there were people from Spain, France, Sweden, Denmark, Turkey, Germany, and Austria, and among others. And the focus groups focused on different types of technology that involved AI, automation, and robotics that were being used in the retail sector in recent years. And it focused on the issues of customer experience, sales, and work in the sector, as well as discussing trade union responses, what trade union responses there had been, and what responses there could be, or perhaps should be. So in the discussions, a number of key technological developments involving AI and automation were discussed. And the focus was on those that had particular implications for work in the sector. So the sort of developments that were discussed, or the applications of technology that emerged as having particular implications for work, are listed here on the right. And they involve things like automatic ordering and stock replenishment systems, work staff, planning and scheduling systems that were automated, predictive marketing that perhaps online, or even for in store if you're sort of member of the store, and things like autonomous warehouses, so amongst other things. So obviously not all of these are entirely new technologies as such, but they kind of represent new uses that combined existing technologies in new ways. So, so just to give an idea of how these things relate to each other, in this figure, you can see on the left is a list of technologies, some of which are newer, some of which have been around for a while. So things like sales and customer data, which is perhaps more available now than it was previously. Remote sensing and sensors in store, cameras, all of these things could be used to feed data into the systems on the right. And in the middle, we see a list of some of the processes that were involved in processing the data and feeding into the applications. So this included things like natural language processing, and machine learning, and AI. So in the report, we go into detail about each of these different applications, what some of the benefits are, and what some of the challenges are that arise from their use and the different ways that they're being used. But in this presentation, we're going to focus on the 4 main challenges that kind of emerge from different uses of these applications. So I'll hand over to you, Steve.
Thanks. So I'll cover the first 2. The first is the competitive transformations that we've seen in the retail sector in recent years. So you can kind of sum this up if you look at the share of e-commerce sales in the UK retail sector as a proportion of total sales. At the beginning of 2020, e-commerce accounted for about 15 to 20% of UK retail sales. By the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, in scare quotes, by the end of 2021. This figure had essentially added about 50% or so. So now around about a third of UK retail sales are facilitated over the internet. So that's a very significant increase in the share of e-commerce sales. This, of course, has very significant implications for the high street that I'll cover in the next slide. But it's also given rise to the expectation by consumers of omni-channel retail sales possibilities. So increasingly, consumers expect bricks and mortar stores not only to have an online presence, but also to be able to integrate their in-store and online marketplaces so that you can do things, for instance, like buying online first and then going in store and collecting. So there's been a very strong emphasis led really by the big e-commerce players like Amazon, which has pushed traditional retailers into these omni-channel retail offerings, integrating their online and in-store presences. This has necessitated very big capital investments, quite unprecedented, I would say, in the sector, which has been dominated, as I mentioned before, by quite slow and low investment for some time. Now we've seen very, very big capital outlays by the big players to boost and integrate these services, and also to facilitate things like rapid delivery with ever increasingly shorter delivery times, down from a day or two to a few hours, and now in areas like Q-commerce and so on, 15 to 20 minutes. This also raises the question of quite unequal regulatory regimes and the possibilities of e-commerce players avoiding rent or paying into different taxation regimes to traditional bricks and mortar retailers. So the rise of e-commerce and the rise of very, very big and predominantly online players has shifted the competitive landscape very dramatically and forced a reorganization of the sector and also necessitated big capital investments by bricks and mortar retailers to be able to keep up if they are to survive. Next slide, please. So this has led to the second big challenge that we emphasize in the report, particularly significant for workers, which is the very rapid employment restructuring that this business restructuring has given rise to. We sum this up with these two terms in the report. The first is the logisticization of retail, by which we mean simply that if you look at the first bullet point there, we find that retail jobs are very rapidly moving from the shop floor and from the checkout into the warehouse and the delivery van, so that increasingly as the share of e-commerce sales increases and people use home delivery more and more often, the very profile of retail sector jobs and how we think of them becomes quite different too. So rather than being a checkout operator, you may be a home delivery grocery worker, for instance, and still be employed by a supermarket. So if we look at the kinds of employment churn that are going on in this reorganization, we find 200,000 retail jobs destroyed in the UK in 2020 alone. But Amazon by itself creating 25,000 new retail jobs. So a very rapid process of what we could call creative destruction in the sector. Lots of older, predominantly shop floor jobs disappearing, and lots of new warehouse and home delivery jobs being created at the same time. So the overall share of retail employment actually hasn't changed all that much. But if you look below that data into these shifts from in-store to online kinds of jobs, then you do see very dramatic churn going on below the surface. The second term that we try to that we introduce in the report is this notion of platformization. This is more at the margins than at the core, but it's rapidly becoming quite significant. So what we see is partnerships between platform companies like TaskRabbit, for example, which has partnered up with IKEA, the big furniture retailer that I'm sure you're familiar with. If you look over there on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see a TaskRabbit worker, not employed by IKEA, but when you check out from the IKEA website, at least in the UK, you're able to hire a TaskRabbit worker to come and assemble your furniture at home. More at the core of retail, we see partnerships, for example, between Amazon and Morrisons, the large grocery retailer in the UK. You can now order Morrisons groceries over the Amazon platform, and an Amazon driver will go into the store, collect them for you, and bring them to you for a very small fee. So we see the engagement of external platform workers by the big retailers. And we see one potential problem here, which is that this can fragment existing workplace organizing, insofar as it moves workers from being retail workers to either self-employed platform workers or just to being warehouse or delivery drivers. And therefore, they may well fall under different or non-existent collective agreements to those that have been established in the retail sector.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So, and the third challenge that was identified in the research relates to issues around surveillance, control, transparency, and trust. So to give you some examples of the sorts of things we're talking about. So, for example, one of the technological developments is that in some cases you see workers having various wearable technologies and the use of RFID tags, that's radio frequency identification. So different devices that can help track workers. So this can be used to help direct them to the right shelves or in a warehouse, for example, in order to pick goods that are going to be going out of the store. But it could also, or to direct people to in-store to areas where they need to do tasks or speak to customers, for example. But these also raise questions about privacy and use of data, whether or not the data is going to be used just for that use or for other uses, and the security of that data. So, and then the second type of technology that was discussed was the use of things like in-store cameras and sensors to enable stores to create heat maps of where areas of the store that are busy, or how busy different stores were getting, which can be used to create to inform dynamic targets for sales staff, for example. And then the third technological development that was talked about was things like automated work planning and scheduling. So these are sort of automated systems that draw in data from various places, including things like weather data, for example, or historical data on how busy stores were, in order to schedule how many staff were needed on that particular day, or even on finer grain periods of time. So obviously all of these uses involve extensive data gathering. So as I mentioned, this raises questions about privacy and what that data is going to be used for. And it also enables worker surveillance and monitoring on a much more extensive scale than we've perhaps seen. Worker surveillance and monitoring is not something that's new, but using these kinds of systems and the data from the different sources, and because of the automation that's involved, you can monitor staff on a much faster scale, rather than having individual human managers only being able to monitor a certain amount of data at any one point in time. And this raises concerns about the opaque forms that these kinds of systems, algorithmic systems, use. So this idea of they can sometimes appear like a black box system that even managers aren't sure about what's involved or what data is being processed and how it's being processed, which can create a situation where the decisions that are made by these systems are difficult to challenge, as they appear sort of objective and scientific. This kind of the computer says, I can't do anything about it. that kind of situation. And altogether, this raises concerns about transparency, about accountability, and about ultimately about trust between workers and their employers. So the fourth challenge that was raised was about issues around overconsumption, debt, and the environmental impact that these technologies were potentially having. So, for example, the extreme convenience that's created by things like e-commerce and quick commerce, the ability to order, to buy things anywhere from your mobile phone, for example, and to get them really quickly, even as fast as in the next 15, 20 minutes. Combined with the sophisticated predictive marketing that's often used, for example, in online stores to try and tempt you to buy things that are perhaps more suited to your kind of what you might want. And then finally, with the easy availability of credit. So, for example, you can put things in your basket and pay for them over a longer period of time, sort of buy now, pay later, and sometimes over, which involves getting credit of different types. So the concern is that these things combined can lead to overconsumption, encourage some people to spend more than they can perhaps afford, which can potentially lead to increased indebtedness for some people. And obviously this has, although the increased sales are good for, retailers or for the retail sector more generally, there's also potentially an environmental impact of this increased sort of consumption on the grand scale. So over to you, Steve.
Thanks. So on this slide, we highlight some of these challenges and just re-emphasize them. And then in the conclusion of the report, we make a few recommendations for what trade unions in the retail sector may be able to do to help address some of these challenges. So I'll just highlight 4 here. There are more in the report, but these, I suppose, are the main ways that some of these difficulties might be addressed. First of all, is probably most important is to focus on strengthening existing collective agreements where unions already have footholds and space in which to organize. Then those should be doubled down upon and strengthened in order to make sure that they don't become eroded over time as these technological changes are rolled out more widely. And second is to try to incorporate workers traditionally outside of the purview of the retail sector into these collective agreements. So to see whether it's possible, for instance, to recruit home delivery workers and warehouse workers into the scope of retail sector collective agreements. Of course, this will look quite different in different national contexts, but I think that's the broad principle that should exist. As the retail sector experiences this kind of employment churn that I discussed, and jobs move from the shop floor to the warehouse and the delivery van, I think unions have to follow those movements and try to work along those lines too, difficult as it may be. I think a second broad principle is that workers should be consulted on the technological changes that are being rolled out. Second is to focus on skilling campaigns for retail workers. So very often retail workers have no formal skills whatsoever and are understood to be unskilled workers, despite in fact, accumulating quite a lot of skills and human capital throughout their working lives. And therefore, one means of addressing this issue and to slow down the employment churn and to make sure that skills that are developed on the job are recognized is to campaign for continuous professional development schemes that mean that workers' skills can be taken from one role to another without diminishment of pay or conditions. Alongside this, this would help unions to campaign for upskilling and reskilling in the face of employment change and restructuring. Third is to push for greater transparency against the kind of black box algorithmic technologies that Will highlighted 2 slides back, and to ensure that management is not able to blame decisions on algorithms which they claim not to understand or not to have any control over. I think the broad principle should be that if an algorithm is making a decision, management should be able to understand and also be able to challenge that decision. And therefore, if that principle is enshrined by unions, then it will make things much easier for themselves to be able to challenge decisions when algorithmic decision-making seems to tilt the scales against workers in particular conditions. And then fourth is a broader point, I think, is to try to figure out how better to work with civil society organizations in order to make community unionism a possibility in the sector. So in the report, we draw on the example of Make Amazon Pay, which Europa has been involved in establishing, and look at how they attempt to link unionization drives in Amazon warehouses with, for instance, tax justice campaigns who have tried to challenge Amazon on taxation grounds, and environmentalists who have been able to challenge the company on environmental grounds of poor use of logistics technologies, leading to increased emissions and so on. So I think involving broader social actors beyond the immediate workplace should be another priority for unions who are trying to organize on what can be quite difficult terrain. So I think we'll leave things there. Hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you both to William and Stephen for an insightful presentation on the right way to look at the effects of AI in retail. We appreciate having this, this new technology clarified regarding its implication, and your report is especially useful for the trade union work that we do. So we are really appreciate that, and thank you very much. And we will be opening the discussion now, so all of the participants can forward questions, reflections, or comments to the speakers. There is a Q&A feature right next to the chat button. Annika and I will be monitoring this section and even the chat if it is more comfortable for you. Okay, there's a question coming in, first one. So from Mirko Herbeck from FES, can we establish and later extend the due diligence obligation of retailers to platformize workers doing connected service work, example IKEA and TaskRabbit?
Should we take these now, Jeff? Or?
Yeah, we could take this now, and then let's see if there are more coming up right after.
Yeah, thanks, Mirko. It's a great question. I don't know the answer because I don't know of any examples where this kind of due diligence has been formalized in these platform arrangements. I think it's a critically important question, and I think it should probably be a focus for unions operating in the sector. I think to ensure that core employment conditions are not eroded by the engagement of external platform workers who are typically self-employed, very often endure very, very long working hours, earn less than the hourly minimum wage for employed workers, for example. I think there's a clear incentive for retailers to engage these platforms because they're so cheap and because they don't come with any of the commitments that hiring formerly employed workers internally comes along with. So I think, establishing limits and responsibilities on how platforms are engaged by retailers is very important, whether it's possible and how best we might go about doing that, I think, is another question. So unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer as to whether it's possible, but one would hope so. I don't know if you want to add anything, Will.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything I can add to that really, other than I I think this is an issue that people were concerned about, that basically, you know, you've got these big platforms that don't necessarily, you know, you've got existing kind of, in some countries, and there's existing collective agreements with retail employers that have taken years and years to develop, and then all of a sudden you have these new players who aren't necessarily in the same, you know, there's questions about whether or not they're the same sector, whether or not the unions, their workers are represented by the unions, the same unions, and that it's very difficult because in some cases existing collective agreements don't cover them if they're considered to be in another sector. So yeah, so it was just these are the kinds of challenges that are particularly people were wrestling with.
I would add, though, in the report, we do emphasize that platformization is a trend that's more at the margins than at the core of the retail sector at the moment. This could change, of course, but we anticipate that it probably won't become hugely significant for a couple of reasons. First is that, you know, employers ultimately depend upon their staff. There's a reason that retailers hire people formally. It's that they want to train them in particular skills to make sure that they're able to do the job properly. None of those are possible when you engage external platform workers working for another firm. And therefore, you know, our expectation is that there'll be this kind of use of platform labor at the margins, more, I think, as a way of retailers testing the waters in areas like rapid home delivery to see whether it makes economic sense to do this or not. And then possibly, if it does, then engaging those their own home delivery workers, drivers, and so on as formal employees, rather than relying on platforms indefinitely for the reasons that I mentioned. They're not able to control or to train those staff who are external workers.
Great, thank you for that answer. Yeah, I agree. I mean, the AI is changing not only the format, I know, of the business itself, but also work arrangement and also the representation and how to harmonize all those in different sectors that is trying to hold them together. So we have new questions coming in. We got other 2 extras and also in the chat box. So we got one from, actually 2 questions from Isabel. Did you see big differences between trade union organizations in addressing the impacts of AI on retail, depending on cultural and institutional environments, South versus North? Also, what about the gender dimension in the AI impact on retail, with trade union organizations challenged already in the traditional retail sector to address the issue? Yeah, there's the gender theme there. Also in the chat box, we got one from Irena. She says, hello, how can trade unions can boost upskilling and reskilling and continuing professional development? Please give some good examples. And so great report, says Annette. Thank you. My question is, could you reflect about a potential transformation of power based in creative destruction? Your example from UK, 200,000 employments disappear and Amazon constructs 25,000. Influence of worker conditions. So we got a bunch here. So I will hand it over to you again, Stephen and Will.
So some great questions there. I probably can't answer everything. I'll just say something about the first 2 for the time being. Yes, there are huge differences. Our report mainly looked at Europe, and we found very, very significant differences between North and South, broadly speaking. The retail sector in the Nordic economies looks very, very different to how it looks in Southern or even Western Europe. There are far higher rates of unionization, more in the region. Of course, it still varies internally in the Nordic economies, but more in the region of about 50% unionization rates. and then down to, in the region of 10 to 20% in much of Western and Southern Europe. So that in itself gives rise to very different management union relationships. We find effectively kind of corporatist relations in the Nordic economies, far higher rates of cooperation between management and unions about the introduction of new technologies, and much more engagement generally in terms of the conditions of work, and very, very strong collective bargaining agreements. So one of the challenges of putting together a sectoral report like this is these huge variations that exist between economies. However, you do see aspects of convergence here. So despite what I just said about these differences, you did still find quite a lot of concern from unions in the Nordic economies about the implications of these new technologies on their workplaces. A general tendency by management to consult less in the introduction of some of these technologies, and still fears about the introduction of things like the black box algorithmic decision makings that are used in very serious questions like hiring and firing of workers, for example, or performance management in the workplace, whereby it's very difficult for workers and unions to challenge the decisions that are being made, because they are being made by algorithms over which management often don't understand or have much control at all. So yes, a lot of divergence, but also some aspects with the rapidity of the technological change giving rise to elements of similarity in both contexts. And then just quickly on the question of gender, I think the employment churn that we raised in a couple of the slides, and this shift of workers from shop floors to warehouses and home delivery is indeed having a huge impact, I think, upon the gender profile of workers in particular. It was a little easier to get data about that. I don't have it on to hand at the moment, unfortunately, but warehouse and logistics work, as maybe you would expect, is really a male-dominated sector, whereas in-store checkout and shop floor work is a much more, you find a far higher rate of women workers. And therefore, I think this kind of restructuring does have very big gender implications that we are not fully getting to grips with, but I think will be quite problematic, I think, for those kinds of women workers who have traditionally relied upon the retail sector as an entry point into the labor market. I think things will be perhaps more difficult for them going forward.
So I think the next question was about how can we boost CPD or and upskilling. So so I don't know what really. So I think this was the kind of, these were more like questions really than answers that were given. I think what was identified amongst in the focus groups was the need for this to happen, and that these look like issues that are going to have to be addressed with the increased use of technology, and just changing from one job to another. That in order to ensure that people aren't just made redundant, that there needs to be some form of negotiation, or to try and encourage employers to sign up to some form of retraining. I mean, in some respects, there was a recognition that this wasn't necessarily, or might be very difficult to get employers to retrain. If you have very good employers, then hopefully they will want to keep people, and obviously there's a cost involved with recruiting and that kind of thing. So, but also that there's a place for governments really and education systems to try and to address some of these issues, which is a wider issue with technological development generally and digitalization of all kinds of jobs. I think there is already some recognition amongst governments that they might need to introduce various types of funding in order to enable people who perhaps don't already have a high level of qualification, or might be at a later stage of their career. Maybe they've already had to change careers more than once because of closures of other industries and they've ended up working in retail. That there should be some sort of support net in order to support workers to retrain for either another sector or another role within the same sector. So there are, things like learner accounts was one thing that was discussed in the UK. I'm not really sure what happened with that policy, whether that's really come into play. But in some other countries where there's they followed more of a flexicurity kind of approach. There's been for some time discussion about how to retrain workers to move from one career into another career, or whether it be from a sector to a more technologically developed sector. So I don't think there's any clear answers for that, but there was a recognition that there was a need to engage employers, to engage policymakers more generally, to try and ensure that there is some kind of somewhere some support for retraining and upskilling. And then the final question was about the transformation of power in platformization. So Steve talked about the number of decrease in traditional bricks and store retail jobs, and then the increase in jobs working for e-commerce platforms, for example. So I think there was a recognition that this, I don't know, this could undermine the power of workers, and also what we talked about in the report is this fragmentation from where you've got now, whereas you had a sort of certain body of retail workers, now all of a sudden that's slightly smaller, but you've got these other workers who nominally perhaps you might, or have traditionally been seen as logistics workers, for example, and depending on the country, that they're not necessarily even covered by the same unions, or where there are high numbers of self-employed workers. Obviously they're much less likely to be a member of a union anyway. So obviously this does have implications for the power that workers have, or that unions have, and it undermines to some extent that level of power. So there was a discussion about how do you reach out, how do you work together with different unions, how do you make sure that unions cover workers who still work essentially for the retail sector, but no longer work for retail companies as such. And I think this was recognized that this was a significant challenge, and that there weren't any easy answers. There was discussions about how unions can work together, but I'm not sure there's any easy answers. I don't know, Steve, do you want to say something? Can you add anything to that?
Very quickly, I think we're quite over time, but I'll just say that on the question of CPD and upskilling and so on, we did find a couple of examples, divergent examples, I suppose. So in Sweden, for instance, we find 1 billion euros per year being spent for workers to be able to spend a year away from work as a sabbatical, essentially to retrain and upskill themselves, during which time they're earning 80% of their former salary, which is paid for by the state. So that's one example which you could say, I suppose, is state-led. And then we find in Denmark, HK, one of the Europa partner unions, pushing for widespread member retraining initiatives, which will be funded principally by employers with some success. So we see different models of how you can do this. You can push for employers to fund it, if that makes sense in your country, or you can push for the state to fund these kinds of initiatives if you think that that's a possibility too. I think probably we should leave things there. I think we're over time and there are more speakers to come. No?
Yeah. So
I can try to answer some questions by text in the chat. The ones we didn't get to.
That's
Okay.
great. So I thank you again, both Stephen and Will, for the great work you've done in preparing this interesting and insightful study. So also thank you for the ones who sent in some questions, and probably the ones that we didn't get. If we have time, we can pick it up later. But we have to do some time management here. We have 2 more sessions. We have time until 12. So we got 1 hour more, and we have 2 more sessions. The first part is the impacts of AI in retail. And then the second one is regarding the benefits and challenges and implications from a trade union perspective. So I'm gonna go ahead and introduce the first 2 panelists of the part 1, the first session. We will have Eckhard Ernst, Mr. Eckhard Ernst, Chief Macroeconomist at the ILO, International Labor Organization, where he is responsible for understanding the future of work and analyzing alternative paths for jobs and earnings to improve upon current trends. Also, on the second speaker, we're going to have Yuri Branca, who works in the fields of skill needs analysis, forecasting, and labor market intelligence, an expert at the European Center for the Development of Vocational Education and Training, CDFOP. So I'm going to give the floor right away to Mr. Ernst.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you very much to Oliver from FEST and to Annika from Uni to have us ILO here today. First of all, congratulations to Will and Steve for a very interesting report. Let me just share my screen here. I wanted to share some insights from a recent solutions paper that we did from ILO together with our partner from Geneva Macro Labs on how this general discussion around AI and automation and the future of work impacts also the development in retail. And I'll try to be short in the interest of time. Now, I think the first interesting point, and it goes back to a bit of the discussion we just had, is that the type of AI tools that are currently being developed are actually quite concentrated in very few areas that have little direct implication for, let's say, broader productivity developments. And I think that was a bit of a frustration that we also felt in our work, that we actually don't see much that would really kind of bring in really new developments, new applications that would really make our economies more efficient and our sectors more productive. You see here, essentially, a quarter of it is taken up by private computing. I mean, any tools around computing. And then half of it is around B2B and B2C, and B2C is obviously where retail falls in as well. And then the more interesting applications, like around transportation, smart mobility, on medical applications, or even on, let's say, edtech and fintech developments, are relatively limited overall in terms of the global picture of AI tools development. And I think we need to keep that in mind in order to understand what type of implications we see for the world of work. Now, I tried to summarize this here very broadly in terms of the challenges for workers. And one thing that you will not find on this chart, on this slide, and for a specific reason, is you will not see any implications for the number of jobs, simply because we don't see any impact of AI on the number of jobs. And that is true for the sectoral level, and it is true for the aggregate level. What we do see is developments at the micro and the macro level in terms of distributional impacts. So obviously on the right of this chart, you see all the discussion which we just had this morning around surveillance and how this biases and maybe also the recruitment process, how surveillance and monitoring of workers increases work intensity, with the knock-on effect obviously on OSH, on occupational safety and health issue. The report very rightly points out to the evidence around Amazon warehouses that have seen triple accident rates in comparison to competitors, mostly because of robotization of the processes. And then on the left side, you see the macro distributional challenges. So that actually a lot of these new tools will benefit very few people in terms of skills and in terms of where, in which type of sectors and which type of companies they are located. And I mean, Amazon is one example, obviously, where the company itself makes a huge amount of profit. Other digital or tech companies are the same, but broadly speaking, these benefits or these productivity gains do not spread in the wider economy. And that is a concern, obviously, because in previous waves of technological progress, we actually did see this kind of gradual diffusion of new technologies, new ideas through the economy. And then I wanted to point out to the middle part of this slide, which I think that in the report itself, it was alluded to very briefly, but I think it's a key point, especially when we are looking into retail and service sectors in particular, which is that these tools create possibilities for companies to collude to the disadvantage of workers. Now, how does this work? Actually, when you think about pricing strategies, and I think the report mentioned specifically Amazon. When you think about pricing strategies, these tools obviously supervise or monitor the type of pricing reaction, the dynamic pricing of other competitors, and will react to it. And automatically, these kind of tools can then collude to a higher price and less quality, if you want, on the product market. On the labor market, we haven't seen that yet. So we have seen it on the product market, this type of collusion. We haven't seen it on the labor market, but the obvious example there would be as well that tools that kind of monitor what other companies, what type of compensation packages and what type of working conditions other companies are offering, will then automatically collude. And the key problem here is it's actually extremely hard to detect. In contrast to anti-competitive behavior in the past, there is no obvious communication going on. These tools will automatically collude, and there is a debate, and I think this is important also for this audience to kind of take stock of this danger that we will probably see more and more as these tools diffuse more and more in HR departments. On the other side, it is also a challenge for companies to use these tools. So here, this is evidence from the European Company Survey, dates back to 2019, where you actually see the take-up of HR analytics in different countries, in different companies, split up according to the company size. And you see, unsurprisingly, that smaller companies tend to use less of these tools. One important aspect that I think is important to mention also in relation to the question that was asked in the chat is that you actually do see that Eastern European countries or companies in Eastern European countries seem to use more of these type of tools, whereas companies in countries where have more cooperative trade union management relationships seem to use less of these tools. Now, having said that, the change over time seems to suggest, again, according to the same type of data, that companies with high presence of work councils and trade unions or staff unions, if you want, are also those companies who tend to introduce these tools more rapidly. And what the data doesn't tell us is whether that's because of a collaborative effort to do that, or whether that's on purpose being done by management to improve and increase the supervision of its workforce. But I think, again, it's a key point to take into account that there is an institutional element to the question to what extent these tools are being used, these algorithmic management tools are being used in different companies. I wanted to highlight the solutions on this paper that I mentioned at the beginning, which is available on the net. So if you scan the QR code, you can actually download the paper. And we highlighted six solutions. And I don't want to go through all of them because it will take us too much time. But I wanted to highlight at least 3 that I found particularly relevant. The first one is these digital skills. And I think it's important to stress that digital skills are not only relevant for workers, but also for management, because often it seems to be the case that managers themselves do not understand the limitation of using these skills, especially when it comes down to specifically HR analytics application. A lot of these tools are not well designed and well trained for creating a diverse workforce, and we have seen examples in the past where Amazon tried to use it and it failed miserably to implement it. I think that's a very important point to raise, that actually digital skills need to be improved broadly, and we need to understand fully what are the limitations of these tools. The second point I think I wanted to raise, and it comes back to I think Will's point at the end, is that we should also think about AI as an infrastructure tool that can help us to better navigate the labor market. We are at the ILO trying to collaborate with different providers of these tools in understanding and identifying possibilities to enhance and improve occupational mobility. As you know, and this is particularly true for people in the retail sector, there are often occupational bottlenecks when a shock hits a particular company or particular sector, that people in certain sectors and certain occupations have difficulties to move by upskilling or by valuing their existing skills. So AI as an infrastructure tool can actually help with that by essentially also identifying what type of implicit and non-documented skills and competences workers have. And I think that's something that we need to work together with policymakers in order to identify. And the last point I wanted to mention, and then I stop on this one, is that there is a lot of discussion on regulating AI, and the Commission has put the European Commission has put forward several proposals to this. What is not stressed enough in my sense is that we not only want to regulate AI ex ante, we also need to supervise and monitor these tools ex post once they're in the market. Again, I mentioned algorithmic collusion before. I think it's important that we create a regulatory ecosystem similar to what we have on financial markets that actually can help us supervise and monitor these tools. And obviously trade unions are part of this regulatory ecosystem, but it needs to be stressed and strengthened, because for the moment there's enormous difficulties for think tanks and for researchers and for other supervisory bodies to actually access the data in order to properly analyze the potential opportunities, but especially the potential risks that these tools have. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Eckhart, for that great information you gave us from right away from ILO. So I'm going to give the floor right away also to Mr. Branca for his presentation.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction. So I will start with sharing my screen. And yeah, so I will speak about the work that I am doing and my colleagues are doing in CEDEFOP, which we broadly call as skills intelligence. And for those of you who are not familiar with the type of work CEDEFOP is doing, we are located in Greece, in Thessaloniki. We are one of the EU's specialized agencies that deals basically with these 4 topics that you hear on the screen. So supporting finding best career paths for young people, supporting European mobility of skills, supporting skills development in school and in life. And then the part of work which I'm also engaged in is the matching of skills demand and supply. And basically, CEDEFOP has several lines of work related to this area. We do surveys like European Skills of Job Survey, or together with Eurofound, the other European agency, European Company Survey. We run our own skills forecast. And for example, I am very much involved in the analysis of online job advertisements And I will use the data from this source heavily in this presentation. And basically all of these lines of work has its research and then publications or even online tools. But the real difference I think that we are making is that we basically put together all of this. And we also use labor market and skills data provided by other organizations to blend it into skills intelligence. And we focus on occupations, we focus on sectors, and most importantly, we focus on these great big topics that are transforming economy and skills demand, which is digitalization, green transition, societal challenges like aging and migration, and general economic transformations. Now, these areas that you see now as circled are those that mainly base this presentation on what is happening in the retail sector. And when I say retail, unfortunately, we do not have a specific line on retail. So the data that I will be showing is related to the whole wholesale and retail sector and not just its retail part. It has been mentioned in this first excellent keynote presentation that basically this is the second largest sector of EU economy after manufacturing, and it employs 1 in every 7 workers in the EU, with more than 26 million people employed in 2020. And when looking at the potential of digitalization and of deployment of AI, it is also very important to look at where the jobs actually are based on company sizes. And you see basically that around 1/3 of workers is employed in wholesale and retail establishments that have less than 10 persons employed, and almost another third is employed in organizations who are quite big, with 250 and more employees. And you also see that during last couple of years, you see a decline of this importance of really small organization, and basically all of this change was compensated by the adequate growth of employment in large organizations. And of course, the large organizations in wholesale and retail, this is where you will probably find most of the AI deployment, because it makes much more sense to use them in large organizations. This is around 1/3 of employment, but we still need to keep in mind that for as big part of the labor market in retail, we speak, when it comes to digitalization, mainly just about e-shops or stuff like that, and not about large deployment of AI. Also, what we have been looking quite intensively in recent period is how different economy sectors were affected by the COVID pandemic. And when you look at the employment in wholesale and retail, you see that in this period between 2011 and 2019, around 1.5 million new jobs were created in the sector, but basically almost all of this growth has been erased by the COVID pandemic, and just in the year 2020, around 1 million jobs have been lost in the sector. It was the second largest employment decline, not surprisingly, after the tourism sector, and we might say with a great level of certainty that the retail sector has recovered in 2021, and I will show you how we think the situation will develop further. Now, to the employment structure, it's basically simple. I try to group the different occupations, detailed occupations in the sector, into some broad categories, so you have a good perspective on where the jobs really are. So almost half or 2/5 of the employment are basically sales workers. Then you have another 1/5, which are workers that are employed in business and administration. Another 15% work in manipulation and packaging, almost 10% in clerical jobs. Then workers with medical degrees, who are most likely employed in pharmacies, drivers, and these 6 major groups employ around 93% represent 93% of all jobs in wholesale and retail. And there are some small categories that you see on the right bottom, with approximately 7% of jobs in the sector. Now, when we look at these groups and their employment over time, you see in this chart on the right how big were the employment changes before pandemic, meaning from 2011 to 2019. And you see the most significant job growth in this manipulation and packaging area, followed by sales workers, and then some other groups with much smaller increases. And although we really do not have like much detailed information about what was driving these employment changes, just when you look at the share, the difference of growth between these first two groups, we might say something that this may be related to, for example, rising digitalization, rising online sales, because you still need to manipulate and package and deliver goods, but you don't necessarily need the sales workers to be there between the goods and the customers. There was some growth in more high-skilled jobs related to engineering ICT, which may also strengthen the message I was giving with regard to the main two areas. And also the digitalization may be helping to reduce some jobs in areas like clerical tasks, where there are big advantages related to deployment of digital technologies. And then you may also see there was some decrease in these areas: law, HR, specialized services, support workers, drivers, and so on. But we really don't know what was happening there. And this might not be really related to any technology deployment, but the simple fact that the retail organizations may have been outsourcing these services to someone else. Now, when we look at the development of employment during the COVID pandemic, actually in the first year of COVID, in 2020, you see there was a huge decrease of employment of sales workers, a bit smaller decrease of employment in the area of manipulation and packaging. And basically you see only growth of the business administration and then people that most likely were employed in pharmacies. I believe that this makes a lot of sense, that you again see that the sales workers, because of the impact of social distancing on retail, may be losing jobs to a huge scale, but because of online sales were continuing, then the manipulation and packaging area was not hit as hard. So this was the employment until 2020. Unfortunately, I do not have more recent data coming from the sector, but because we have this line of work that is focusing on job advertisements, I can at least tell you some hints what might be happening next. So this graph with employment changes still remains on the left side, and now you can see what trends are seeing in the online job advertisements and in which areas the job advertising in retail was growing in 2021. And you see that the business administration was the area where there were most new job advertisements, and this followed by sales workers, which may be offsetting for some employment losses that we have been seeing in 2020. And so we were been thinking quite a lot whether this COVID shift and all of the related impacts on the ways companies were doing business could trigger a large-scale digitalization. But looking at the growth of the employment of job advertising for sales workers, we may it may not be as big as some people might have expected, and that it is possible that at least to a certain degree the retail will return to the ways of operating before COVID, although some advanced digitalization and more online sales will probably remain. Now, when we look at the skill demand that we see from the online job advertisements, and that is related to the job ads in wholesale and retail sector, you see that soft skills are still the most important ones: adaptability, communication, collaboration, and creativity. But the ICT skills are the third most important area mentioned in online job advertisements. And when looking at the skill demand change So which of these skills areas are gaining ground as compared to the year before? You see that it is still the most important groups that are growing most fastest, which means again adaptability and communication. Also, they need to speak foreign languages, and the ICT skill area is the fourth most important growth area of skill demand in retail. So this, I believe, a bit supports the message I have been saying with regard to the employment changes, is that while the digitalization seems to be an important driver of change in the wholesale and retail sector, it is not like the key one, and there are still other important things, other important occupations, and other important skill changes that are not triggered just by the digitalization development in the retail sector. So this was really brief, and I touched upon quite a few things. So just give you last two slides where you can see the links to work that we are doing, our system on that analyzes the online job advertisements, some guides how to interpret and use our data, and the most recent publications that we have been doing, especially in the area of online job advertisements, which is like still quite a new field with a lot of difficulties in interpretation, which we are pointing out in a number of publications that we have been doing together with other partners, also International Labour Organization. Thank you. That's all for me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that analysis, Yuri, delivering to us a broader picture of the sector and where AI might, have greater implications. So again, thank you for both speakers for this session, Eckhard and Yuri. And I'm opening briefly the floor for discussion. So I urge everyone to please utilize the Q&A box for your questions. And perhaps if we cannot answer all of them right now, the speaker can answer them even in written form as we move on the next session. Let me see, chat box. So I would say that while the questions are coming in on the Q&A box, we will be looking at them. I would move on the second session, if that's okay. That's great. Okay. We have the second part and the last part, benefits, challenges, and implications, a trade union perspective. We will have two speakers. First, Ms. Jenny Vranga-Bori, researcher at Commercial Employees Union in Sweden, and Ms. Pilar Rato Rodriguez, Vice President of Europa. So I'll hand first the floor to Ms. Jenny, please.
Thank you. I'll try to share my screen here. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, very clearly.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm going to talk about a study we published a month ago, where we look at the consequences of digital technology being used to surveil the staff. And the study was conducted by me and Cecilia Berggren and investigates the prevalence and consequences of surveillance in retail and warehouse work. And our main finding connects to today's topic in that the technology development creates many ways for employers to monitor performance, something that I will show can easily tip over into surveillance. I can't see which slide we're on, or can you see the be aware sign? There's something technical error here.
Yeah, and I also think, Jenny, that you might, because is it possible to show us the presentation page? Because we can also see.
Let's see. now, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Thank
better.
you.
Yeah.
Thank
Yes.
you. So the report is based on a survey, and it maps how common these different surveillance techniques are. And I will try to focus on the digital monitoring, but we also look at complementary physical acts of supervision and how they work together. And as expected, we find that monitoring at work is increasing, mostly due to the technical development. 30% of retail employees state that it has increased within the last 5 years, and even more in the warehouse sector. And here you can see the systems that we mapped. And to begin with, we can see that it's very widespread, both in retail and warehouses, to be monitored at work. And among members in retail, 94% answer that at least one of the above measures occurs in the workplace. And on average, members state that there are 3 different control measures in the workplace. And at the same time, every 4th person states that there are 5 or more of these systems in place at the same time at their workplace. And most interesting for this presentation is the CCTV, the cameras, and the digital logging, and the individual sales performance monitoring. And digital logging here includes, among other things, tracking of visits to websites, activity in cash register systems, and digital picking systems in warehouses, for example, pick by voice, which is very common here in Sweden. And as you see here, a lot of the warehouse workers experience this. And at the same time, it's very common that our members don't know if these different types of monitoring system exist in their workplace. And this is especially common among retail workers in terms of the use of digital logging, mystery shoppers, and measurements of individual sales. And a major reason why they are not aware of the type of monitoring that occurs is simply because the employer has not informed about it. About half of our members answer that the employer has not informed about what type of data collection occurs in the workplace. And according to GDPR, the employer must clearly inform about these things when personal data is processed. And it's also clear that employers do not comply with the law in a number of other ways as well. About a quarter answer that it is not at all or only partly regulated who has access to the collected data. And the monitoring systems are used in other ways than what was the original purpose, including for detailed monitoring of performance and real-time monitoring of employees. 20% of members in retail and 29% of members in warehouses state that real-time monitoring occurs in the workplace. And when asked which systems are being used for this, it is the technical new systems that are misused in this way. It is the digital picking systems, for example, pick by voice in the warehouses, and it is the cameras in the retail sector, and sometimes in combination. And it is also these 2 systems that members describe the most problems associated with. And at the same time, how you experience these new digital systems depends on how they are used in the workplace. In workplaces where the systems are not abused and used for surveilling the staff, you also see positive sides with them, for example, with the CCTV. But we can also see that very few of our members know what the employer may use the information for legally. Only 15% say they know this. And this is also something that makes it difficult to protest if you feel that the system are being abused, because you simply do not know your rights in this matter. And as we see in this slide, it is the real-time surveillance that contributes strongly to perceiving the monitoring as an invasion of privacy. It is therefore also the digital systems that is a big problem here. So And we see the same connection as in this slide when it comes to whether the employees have been given information about what sort of monitoring is taking place. If the employer follows the law and provides information, the monitoring is perceived as much less intrusive. And the same thing applies to if you know what the information can be used for. So we can really see that it is very important and in everyone's interest that the employees are included even before monitoring systems are implemented in the workplace to ensure that systems do not have negative consequences for the employees. For like I said, the survey shows that it's not necessarily the monitoring in itself that is the problem. It is about why and how it is introduced and used. So how does the monitoring affect the work environment? Overall, the warehouse workers state that the negative effects on different dimensions on work is greater than the retail employees do. And this is mainly because the digital picking systems in the warehouses can collect so much information down to the second. But something that is true for both groups are that they think that it affects the social contact with colleagues negatively. They do not dare to talk and have a good time because they are scared that everything is monitored and that it will look bad in the camera or in the digital log file if they talk to each other. And the effect on the workload also stands out. 43% of warehouse employees and 19% of retail employees state that monitoring has a negative impact on this. And the fact that a large proportion believe that this too are true can be due to the fact that it is often used to monitor employees' performance. And this is something that is becoming more and more far-reaching as the technical systems can gather more and more information and on an individual level, like among other things, camera surveillance, warehouse picking systems, and individual sales performance monitoring. Employers can get a lot of information about how specific employees perform, which tend to lead to an increase in the pace of work. You are constantly worried that everything you do is monitored and assessed. And this, of course, leads to an increased competition and a reduced unity between co-workers. Here, both retail and warehouse employees state that the logging of picking speed in the warehouses and individual sales in retail creates a work culture that does not reward that employees help each other. Instead, it means focusing on just the individual measures and not things that also needs to be done, such as helping a coworker, cleaning the aisles, or providing service to customer before they arrive at the checkout. So this could also be bad for businesses. And we can also see that it risks creating a situation where the employee's motivation to do a good job can decrease. Like this person here says that it makes you do your job much worse when you feel that you are too controlled. It cannot be positive for either staff or company that you always feel that Big Brother is watching. So it risks creating an organizational culture that can be harmful for both the company and the employees. Yeah, just a quick conclusion, like we see that monitoring and surveillance at work is increasing with the technological developments. And we need to make sure the employees know their rights in this matter to be able to protest. Because misuse of monitoring system are relatively common. And it could also mean that we have a harder time organizing. Yeah, and the rise of e-commerce is making this more important as well, because we can see in our study that the surveillance of the staff is more widespread and in the warehouse sector. If you want to read the report, it's being translated right now into English and will hopefully be published this spring. That was it for me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Jenny, for that great presentation and for showing us challenges of AI, not only on skills, on work arrangements and everything, but also on effects on the daily lives of the workers. So thank you for your research from the Swedish perspective. I'm going to move on and give the floor to our next speaker, or to present Ms. Pilar Rato Rodriguez, Vice President of Europa.
Hola, no se me ve, pero bueno, se me oye, que ya es mucho. Vale. Bueno, pues buenos días a todas y a todos. Yo no tengo una presentación, soy prácticamente una analfabeta digital, con lo cual más que nada voy a hacer una presentación hablada que creo que también complementa perfectamente todo lo que se ha venido diciendo. Y aparte de eso, quería comentaros que no solo soy la vicepresidenta de UNI, sino que soy trabajadora del sector de comercio. Desde hace más de 30 años he trabajado en este sector, aunque los últimos, pues liberada sindical, ya no estoy en primera línea, pero es un sector que conozco bien. Y además este sector es un sector clave para algunas economías. En todo caso, para la mía, la española, donde hay cerca de 2.300.000 personas que trabajan en este sector, donde hay cerca de 600.000 empresas, de las cuales el 80% son pymes o micropymes, evidentemente este sí que es uno de los retos que nos va a presentar la digitalización, ver cómo estas empresas de este tamaño se van adaptando a estos nuevos tiempos y a este cambio y transformación permanente. Por eso la reivindicación que llevamos haciendo desde hace mucho tiempo de una transición digital justa adquiere en este sector una gran relevancia. Se están dando muchísimos estudios y este es una prueba de ellos, y se está dando un debate profundo del futuro del sector y los cambios en los diversos aspectos que se tienen que dar. Especialización, adaptación de las nuevas tendencias de consumo, nuevos ámbitos de los consumidores, entre otras. Creo que todos y todas apostamos por un desarrollo comercial sostenible y de calidad, donde las relaciones laborales y la calidad del empleo tienen que tener un papel de primer orden, puesto que el mayor activo del sector son sus trabajadores y sus trabajadoras, y las organizaciones sindicales tenemos que estar muy pendientes de que estos cambios no supongan mermas de derechos ni rebajas en las condiciones salariales. Por eso es bueno realizar análisis y diagnósticos compartidos con los principales agentes del sector comercial, trabajadores y trabajadoras, empresas, consumidores, y creo que esto no debería solo estar impulsado por los agentes sociales, sino también que tendría que haber una implicación de las administraciones públicas para que se puedan dar muchísimos más análisis y hacer muchísimos más estudios. También creo que sería muy positivo la creación de observatorios a nivel nacional con la participación de universidades, agentes sociales, la administración, para hacer y poder seguir haciendo un seguimiento. Hay que resaltar, yo creo, la importancia que tenemos las organizaciones sindicales en participar en este cambio, ya que las relaciones laborales y la propia organización del trabajo van a sufrir un cambio cuantitativo. Y la mejor garantía de una transición digital justa a nivel general es la participación sindical en la implantación y gobernanza de los procesos de digitalización. Se podría establecer protocolos para una transición justa entre las distintas empresas y las organizaciones sindicales, tanto a nivel nacional o europeo, a través de los comités de empresa europeos o del diálogo social sectorial. También reforzar la negociación colectiva. Es verdad que la densidad sindical es muy variada en Europa, igual que su legislación, pero la mejor herramienta que disponemos para poder participar en todos estos cambios es el convenio colectivo sectorial, donde podemos regular cuestiones muy importantes como la formación de los trabajadores y trabajadoras, que garanticen su empleabilidad ante los cambios propuestos y funciones. Podemos establecer clasificaciones adaptadas a nuevos tiempos con niveles retributivos adecuados a estas nuevas funciones y evidentemente está la organización del trabajo, que va a influir en la distribución de la jornada y como consecuencia también en la conciliación de la vida familiar y laboral. Regular también la desconexión digital y el teletrabajo. Ya hay algunos convenios colectivos que tienen regulada tanto la desconexión digital y el teletrabajo, y también hay a nivel nacional algunas legislaciones que han trabajado ya sobre estos temas. No podemos olvidarnos de reforzar los derechos sindicales. Es importante regular los derechos de información y consulta, sobre todo lo referente a los algoritmos, ya que estos son la base de todos los procesos de digitalización y cada vez son más utilizados por las empresas para la organización del trabajo. También la protección de datos, la regulación sobre el derecho de las personas trabajadoras a acceder a los datos que se recogen sobre ellas y la participación de los agentes sociales en su regulación.
Sorry, Pilar, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but the interpreter has asked us to, yes, you have to slow down a bit. So yes,
perfecto, perfecto.
Yeah, so continue, please.
Vale, pues muy bien. La regulación sobre el trabajo de las personas trabajadoras, acceder a los datos de que se recogen sobre ellas y participación de los agentes sociales en su regulación, implementación y control. Para ello, también es necesario formar a nuestro activo sindical para que pueda interpretar y poder defender los derechos de las personas trabajadoras en estos procesos. Resulta estratégico definir una estrategia integral de formación enfocada a la adaptación de los cambios funcionales, competencias digitales y empleabilidad de las plantillas del sector comercial de cara al futuro de los nuevos empleos que puedan crearse. Regulación y legislación son claves para definir el modelo comercial. Tenemos y debemos participar en el desarrollo legislativo, normativo de la actividad comercial, en sus diferentes formatos y subsectores de la actividad, con el objetivo de incidir en la definición de un modelo comercial innovador, resiliente y sostenible. En definitiva, debemos cogobernar el cambio impulsado, corresponsable, con un plan más amplio, aplicable no solo a la negociación colectiva, sino también conseguir acuerdos en torno a varios escenarios: organización del trabajo, reestructuraciones organizativas del empleo, prevención de riesgos laborales, igualdad, y proponer planes sociales para paliar situaciones complicadas que se pueden dar con estos cambios, sobre todo en un aspecto generacional. Apostamos desde las organizaciones sindicales por un sector progresista, social, sostenible, basado en una adecuada regulación, en una globalización con dimensiones sociales, en la generación de empleos de calidad y salarios justos, y en la promoción y protección con normas sociales y medioambientales y laborales. En un sistema comercial alternativo que sea justo, equitativo y también muy especialmente en las cadenas de suministro. De hecho, esto afrontamos como organizaciones sindicales este desafío, yo creo, como hemos afrontado otros en el pasado. Es verdad que los tiempos son distintos. Yo provengo del sector de comercio y si miro hacia atrás, Esto que estamos viviendo actualmente pues no tiene nada que ver con el modelo comercial que yo conocía y en el que yo he desarrollado prácticamente toda mi vida laboral. Pero creo que no se puede negar que los avances son necesarios, que los cambios están ahí y han venido para quedarse y debemos afrontarlo como lo hemos afrontado en otros tiempos. Yo creo que con ilusión, con compromiso y con, sobre todo, voluntad de que estos cambios se hagan siempre con la participación de los trabajadores y las trabajadoras. Yo creo que no somos adivinos cuando hablar de qué puede pasar en el futuro, porque además los cambios son tan continuos y el desarrollo del sector puede sorprendernos de un día a otro. Pero lo que sí estoy convencida que con la colaboración, coordinación entre todos, seremos capaces de afrontar este reto que estamos viviendo y los que vengan en un futuro. Nada más, gracias.
Pilar, gracias. It's always great to hear from you, your perspective and take on such an important issue such as AI, especially in a sector that you say you know very well. I know the retail sector, and I cannot agree more when you say that it is crucial that we need to confirm the centrality of the collective sectorial agreements. In managing AI and its effects on workers. So thank you very much. We appreciate your intervention. So I think we're on time. We will open briefly the discussion. If there is anyone who would like to comment, ask question, intervene in some way about this session. In the meantime, I've seen that on the previous session, questions were asked and also answered. And okay, I can see one from Isabella regarding the presentation of Jenny. The participants to the study are members of the trade union. It's interesting to see how many do not know whether AI is used in their company or what kind of AI. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think if we look outside our organization and everyone in retail, I think it would be even less that know about these things, because our local clubs sometimes negotiate about the system before they are being introduced. And of course, it's easier to know that if there is an exit control where someone searches your bag when you leave work, it's easy to know if that exists because you're physically doing that, but AI is much harder to know. Like the people in the warehouses, the staff there know that the picking system is tracking their every move, but they are unsure how that data is being used. They know that sometimes they use it to localize the staff on the floor and to correct them and tell them to work faster, but it's so much data going into the system, it's very hard to know everything. But I think we could be better at using the GDPR, for example, like using the existing laws to demand to know that, like you are entitled to know how your data is collected and being used. So I think we need to think about how we can like use the existing laws and like, of course, push for more legislation as well, but also how can we use this in the traditional union work that we always do, like and see this as an important union question to get access to the data and to have a say in how data is being collected and used in the workplace.
Very well said. Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, there's a huge theme of transparency on data collection and how this data is being used and how trade unions can access to this and negotiate how these data are being collected and also utilized on workers. So thank you for that question and also for the answer. Any more from the Q&A box? Also from the traditional chat box? So I think, again, if you want to ask further questions, so we will have a few more minutes. You can do it on the Q&A box. Otherwise, I will close this session, and I will hand over it to Stephen Rolf for his concluding remarks.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks to everybody for a really wide-ranging and fascinating discussion. I think the various presentations added a lot of depth. I'm sure you'll all agree to what was quite a brief summary of our study. So, you know, from Eckhard's data and summaries of some of the technologies that are being introduced, and this particular question that was raised about the effects of collusion that are going on and that are being facilitated in the sector by the use of AI and predictive technologies, I think is absolutely critical. And as he said, it came up briefly in our report, but I think there's much more work to be done on the economic restructuring of retail and the impact, particularly on smaller retails and on SMEs of these large-scale capital investments and new kinds of technological changes that are going on, which make it particularly difficult for smaller players who, as Jiri reminded us, are the principal, the backbone really of the sector is made up of SMEs in terms of number of firms and number of employees. They are being put in a particularly difficult situation by these larger players and the kinds of technologies that they can use. And so it follows that workers employed in these SMEs, of course, are also having a more difficult time in terms of employment restructuring, change, and the conditions of their work. So there's a sequence that is coming downstream from these big player investments that are affecting everybody in the sector and squeezing smaller players and facilitating these kinds of restructuring. And then I think that Jenny's research on the kinds of surveillance technologies, again, something we could only kind of touch on in our report and our comments today, but it's a fascinating study and added a lot of depth and real concerns, I think, about the kinds of practices that employers are engaging in without any consultation or even really without their workers knowing about this in large part. So I think there are some, probably it would be fair to say we're at a turning point in the sector in terms of the kinds of technologies that are coming online, in terms of the kinds of economic restructuring that are going on the employer's side, and in terms of the kind of work that's available to workers. So there's many, many big pieces that are moving and the sector is in flux. And I think therefore it was great to hear the comments from Pinar at the end about the role and the persistent role that trade unions can and are able to play in the sector. I think that should be the emphasis going forward. So I think I'll wrap up there unless anybody wants to ask anything else, or if Will wants to add anything, do go ahead. But otherwise, I'll just say thanks again very much to Europa and to FES for funding and supporting this research. Thanks so much to the participants. Again, some of you are here today, so this would not have been possible without the participation of trade unionists from across Europe and further afield. And we're looking forward to engaging with all of you much more in the future on these questions and more. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Let me join you in thanking, today's speakers and researchers, you, William, Stephen, Eckhard, Jiri, Jenny, and Pilar. Thank you for devoting your time and knowledge, of course, and expertise to make certain that the webinar today do greatly enrich trade union actions in dealing with regards to AI and automation in retail. Big thank you also, just like what Steven has said, to both the Uni, Europa, and FES, to both Annika and Oliver for the efforts of your collaboration, bringing us, both the important results of the study and opportunity to have this webinar today. And of course, to all those who have participated, to all the Uni Europa affiliates, and last but not the least, of course, to the technical and organizational staff interpreters. We appreciate your work. The report will be available soon in different languages, right, Annika? French, Spanish, and German. And we will provide a link to all the participants as soon as possible. So we're going to take it from here. Thank you again and have a great day. So we can close it. If anyone wants to dive in, do it. Otherwise, have a great day to everyone. And thank you again. Great. Bye-bye. Thank you.